Well, I think the money problem that we're experiencing now, the recession, it's permanent unless we change our economy, unless we change the very way we deal with money, the way we deal with what we sell to each other, what we make, what we produce, what we do with each other. We've had this, as the indigenous people say, we've had a dream. And the dream, when you have a dream and you give it enough energy, it materializes. The dream we've had has been of extreme materialism and war. Let's face it, our economy is based on the military to a very, very large degree. And we've kind of had this dream of fear that there's others out to get us, whether they're fascists or communists or now terrorists. They're out to get us, and we have to build an economy around that. And it just plain isn't working, and it's not going to work. In the world that we live in today, we've created a failed system. That's all that you can say about it. It's a failed system. And in fact, we're less than 5% of the world's population live in one country, the United States, and consume approximately 30% of the world's resources, while roughly half the world lives in dire poverty, starving or on the verge of starvation. The only way you can describe that is a total failure. It's not a model. You can't sell this as a model to Africa or India or Latin America. We'd need another 5 planets just like this one without human beings on it, but with all the resources in order to continue this model in the rest of the world. So it's not a model, it's a failure. And it's time we really recognize that it's a failure, stood up to it. And in the process, we have to recognize that it's also a huge success for very few people that are getting extremely wealthy and powerful off this. They want it to perpetuate, but we're going to have to put an end to it if we want to survive as a species. I think the future of the human species revolves around what we do in the next years. To say capitalism is evil, I think, is naive, because capitalism can take many forms. There really isn't even a good definition of capitalism. I mean, you could conceive as capital as being creativity. That is a form of capital. So it's a strange word. But the fact of the matter is we've had an economic system that we call capitalism for roughly 400 years, and it's taken many different forms. It's a chameleon. Some of them have been relatively successful, others have not. The form we have today, which really started in the 70s when I was an economic hitman and took off big time in 1980 when Ronald Reagan embraced it and embraced Milton Friedman, the theories that Milton Friedman espoused, and Margaret Thatcher embraced them, and so did Odson of Iceland and many other world leaders. This form of capitalism we've had since that time is what I call predatory. And I think it's a mutant virus. It's spreading like wildfire across the world. But it's dangerous, it's unstable, it's unsustainable. It's brought us to this recession and is never going to get us out of this recession. It's going to get us deeper and deeper into trouble. It's exploitative, it's selfish, it's greedy, it's extremely materialistic, and it just plain isn't working. It's very predatory. And so what do we do to change it? And people sometimes criticize me because I don't advocate overthrowing capitalism. But again, I'm not even sure what capitalism is. And I suspect that in my lifetime, we're not going to overthrow the current system that's based so strongly on big corporations. I want to see change in my lifetime. I'm 65. I have a 3-year-old grandson. I think I have a fighting chance of making significant changes in the attitudes of corporations, of getting us away from that type of capitalism that was espoused by Milton Friedman, which basically has 3 tenets, turning those tenets around and bringing us into a form of economics, call it capitalism, call it Sufism, call it, whatever you want to call it Googleism. It doesn't matter what you call it, but bringing it into a form of economics that is compassionate, that says that corporations ought to serve the public interest. And actually, if you look at history, you see that for the first 100 years of the U.S., no corporation was granted a charter unless it proved that it was going to serve the public interest. Charters lasted on average 10 years, and then a corporation had to go back and prove that it had served the public interest and that it would continue to do so in order to get another charter. I don't see anything wrong with that. I think that's a form of capitalism that I could live with, where we see corporations as serving a public interest, in addition to making a decent rate of return for investors. Let's face it, under capitalism, capital has to get a return on its investment in order to continue. But it doesn't have to be an outrageous return on investment. And it doesn't have to be based on the premise that Milton Friedman defined, that the only business of business is to maximize profits regardless of social and environmental costs. We can turn that around and say, listen, businesses can make profits, investors can get a return on their investment, but only within the context of creating a sustainable, just, and peaceful world. Let's set some guidelines around this idea of what it is to run a business or to make profits. We economic hitmen created this debacle that we're in today. We were the proponents of what I call predatory capitalism at this point. And I think it's fair to say that we've created the world's first truly global empire, and an empire that for the first time in history hasn't been established primarily through the military. It's been established through economics and economic hitmen. And we worked many different ways, but the most generic, the most common approach is to identify a country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sisters. However, that money doesn't go to the country. Instead, it goes to our own corporations to build big infrastructure projects in that country, things like power plants and industrial parks and highways that benefit a few very wealthy and powerful families in that country, as well as our own corporations, who are the primary beneficiaries. But these projects don't help the majority of the people. They can't afford electricity. Industrial parks don't hire many people. Most of the people can't afford cars to drive on the highways. And yet they're left holding a huge debt. And the debt payment, servicing that debt, takes everything out of the economy. So there's nothing left to put into health services or education or other social services. And at some point, we economic hitmen go back and we say, listen, you can't pay your debts, so give us a pound of flesh. Sell your oil very cheap to our oil companies without any environmental restrictions, or allow us to build a military base on your soil, or support us in the next critical United Nations vote with us. And in that way, we've really managed to create an empire. It's a subtle empire. For the most part, we don't have military forces occupying these countries, although they are present in most of the countries. But we've done it through economics, and yet the military is always there to back up the economic hitmen if we fail. But before the military steps in, on the few occasions when economic hitmen fail, and I talk in my books about how I failed with the democratically elected president of Ecuador, Jaime Roldos, and Omar Torrijos of Panama, I couldn't corrupt them. I couldn't bring them around. I couldn't get them to accept these horrible conditions for their country, to bankrupt their countries. And at times like that, the jackals step in. These are people who either overthrow governments or assassinate their leaders. Both Roldos of Ecuador and Torrijos of Panama were assassinated by the jackals because I couldn't bring them around, nor could other economic hitmen. They simply wouldn't be corrupted. They wouldn't be brought into the system. And in the few instances where the jackals fail, which is what happened with Saddam Hussein, it's what's happened with the Taliban and Osama bin Laden, when the economic hitmen and the jackals both fail, then we send in the military as the last resort, which of course is what we did in Iraq and are doing today in Afghanistan.
It's all behind a veil.
It's all behind a veil. One of the most dangerous things I believe of all of this is that it's such a secret. It's clandestine. You know, every other major empire in the history of the world has been built on military force, and everybody in the country has known it's happening. The Romans knew it, the Greeks knew it, the British knew it, the Spaniards knew it, the Portuguese knew it, and they were proud. And they always found a justification, you know, spreading civilization, spreading Christianity, something. But they knew they were sending their young men off to conquer other lands, and they glorified it. But this is the first empire that's been created in denial, public denial. So we say we're spreading democracy. We're not. We're spreading empire. And I think it's a huge danger to a democracy, which we claim to be, to do these things, because a democracy is built on the premise that you have an informed electorate. And if our electorate doesn't understand this most basic premise of our foreign policy, then we're not informed. And if we're not informed, we really can't vote democratically. And so exposing the system and the underlying causes is essential to democracy. What we're doing with books like Confessions of an Economic Hitman and this film that we're making right now and other things that are out there is serving democracy in the best way. And I have to say that it's very disturbing to me when the U.S. government, the White House and the Pentagon so violently attack something like WikiLeaks that's exposing supposedly classified secrets, when in fact what they're doing is exposing the truth, knowledge. And in a democracy, you have to do that. Our government should be going after the people that perpetrated the crimes that have been exposed, and not after the journalists who make these things evident to the public. And I think this is a very dangerous situation, but it goes along with this rising tide that started in the 70s when I was an economic hitman and has been growing ever since. You know, if you talk of empire, you have to ask yourself, who's the emperor? An emperor is not elected, it doesn't serve a limited term, and doesn't report to anybody. And certainly US presidents don't fall in that category. But we do have a group of people that are the modern equivalent of the emperor. And this is the people who run our biggest corporations. I call them the corporatocracy. And this isn't a conspiracy theory. These people don't have to get together in dark rooms and hiding and conspire to do something illegal. Many of them never meet each other. They don't have anything to do with each other. But they do control the press, the mainstream press, either through outright ownership or advertising budgets. They control our elected officials through campaign financing. There's no question about it, including President Obama. We've seen that very clearly now. And they control governments around the world. They control the economies. And they are all driven by this one goal, and that is to maximize profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs. And so in achieving that goal, they go to any ends to make sure that's happened. They don't have to conspire, but they all know what they have to make happen. So you can have companies like Nike and Reebok competing for your dollar in the marketplace, or Exxon and BP competing for your dollar at the pump. But when it comes to a united front, in order to make sure that the right laws are legislated that protect their interest, they all come together. The Nikes and the Reeboks and all the petroleum companies, they all come together because, and it's not a conspiracy, but they all know what they have to do in order to keep the rules and regulations in place that will allow them to maximize profits regardless of social and environmental costs. They are the modern equivalent of an emperor. And they're global, there's no question. You know, in most of my lifetime, you could look at the planet as this globe with roughly 200 countries, of which a few had a lot of power. The United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, the United States at different times. But today, you might better envision this world as a globe with roughly 200 countries and huge clouds drifting around it. These are the big corporations. They know no national borders. They don't follow any specific sets of laws. They strike partnerships with the Chinese and the Tibetans and the Taiwanese, with the Israelis and the Palestinians, with anyone who has resources or markets they covet. They are the modern equivalent of the emperor, and they're very, very global. This is something extremely new in history. We're at a time that's similar to when when city-states became nations. Except today, the nations have lost their relevance from a geopolitical standpoint. It's the big corporations. And in fact, the big corporations pretty much call the shots for the CIA and the US military. Whenever they're in trouble, those forces go in to protect their interests. Well, what goes around comes around. And, you know, when I was an economic hitman back in the 70s, the whole focus was on garnering all the resources from other countries, primarily third world countries, and bringing them to our own corporations. But the very techniques that we used there were extremely efficient and effective. And so it was just a matter of time before they were to be employed here in the United States against our own people. And that's what's happened now. That's definitely going on. And I think we the people have to take the blame. We were quite willing to sit back and watch this happen around the world. We were very willing to say, hey, I want cheap shirts, even if those are made by slaves in sweatshops in Indonesia. I'll just look the other way. And I want cheap petroleum, even if that means destroying the Amazon rainforest or the Gulf of Mexico. I'll just look the other way. Just keep giving me this cheap stuff. And so, should it be any surprise, really, that we would be vulnerable to that ourselves? These methods were very effective, and they've come home to roost now. And it's one of the reasons we're having this recession here. We've been exploited, we the people of the United States have been exploited very much as we allowed the corporatocracy to exploit the people of Ecuador, Indonesia, Botswana, Nigeria, or wherever around the world. It's a very unbalanced system where you've got a few extremely wealthy people and the rest of the people are verging on failure, bankruptcy, whatever. It's a technique we perfected in the 70s and 80s. Economic hitmen were very good at this. This is what happened to Venezuela, for example. There's a great example. The largest middle class in South America at one time. And, the economic hitmen went in and said, listen, hey, Venezuela, you got lots of oil under your soil. So we'll use that as collateral and make huge loans to you as a country and to individuals. You individuals who are building industries, the growing wealthy of Venezuela, take out huge loans. And the collateral is the oil under the ground and the economic future of your country. And then the market fell out of the price of oil several times at different times, and things started to fail. And the economic hitmen went back in, the World Bank went back in, the IMF went in and refinanced these loans to make it even more difficult ultimately in the long run. It seemed like a gift at the time, but in the long run it put these countries and individuals in those countries in even more dire positions. But always there's a few individuals who collaborate. And they usually end up running the government. And one of the presidents, a famous president of Venezuela, his name was Perez, was among those who became the wealthiest person in Latin America. And there was a tremendous corruption. And what you saw happen was the country with the largest middle class in Latin America suddenly lost its middle class. It essentially disappeared. There's still a few there. There's merchants and businessmen that are doing fairly well because they cooperate with the system. But really, most of the middle class dropped down into the lower classes. And that's when Hugo Chavez came in and was elected. And I think many people in the United States don't understand the context of how that happened. And suddenly you've got a president who, to begin with, was not extremely vociferous. He got along quite well with President Carter. But then he criticized the way that Bush responded to 9/11 quite severely. And that created a tremendous amount of antagonism. And of course, Chavez is a very outspoken individual. And you have to ask yourself with people like that, even with George Washington, is there a slight aspect of craziness in these people? I mean, think of George Washington, probably the wealthiest man in the United States, put his neck in a noose, would have been hanged if we'd lost the revolution. And he went up against the mightiest empire in the history of the world at that time, the British Empire. Why? I mean, idealistic, yes, but there's something else going on. Extremely courageous, yes. And you could say the same things about a guy like Chavez. He's done something incredibly courageous, and you might almost say foolhardy and crazy in a way. He's gone up against the largest, most powerful empire in the history of the world and happens to be sitting in his backyard. But he's also changed history and started a revolution that's spreading around Latin America. Now, since him, 9 other countries have elected presidents that are standing up pretty strongly to the corporatocracy. But until he came along, what we did in Venezuela as economic hitman was very successful, putting people into dire debt, deep debt, that they ultimately couldn't get out of. And then we owned them. And we created this um, lower class. We turned the middle class into the lower class. And when you do that, when you have desperate people who are losing their mortgages and losing their businesses or losing their jobs, you've got a great resource to exploit if you want to exploit it. So then we said, well, if it worked in all these other countries, why not the United States? And the classic example is the bankers going out to people and saying, listen, you can afford a $500,000 home, even if it was pretty obvious they could only afford a $300,000 home. And they would say, so take out a bigger mortgage than you think you can afford, tighten your belt a little bit for a year or two, but you're going to see that $500,000 house is going to be worth $1 million in 5 years. So you're building equity, and we'll give you that loan. And then the market crashed. The $500,000 home is now worth $200,000. The people are still trying to pay their mortgage on a $500,000 house. They can't get out from under it. And those are the kind of people that are not going to go out in the streets and demonstrate. Those are the kind of people that are probably going to send their sons to Iraq, Afghanistan, or the sons are just going to voluntarily go and fall in behind the system. They're captives of the system. They're going to tread very, very carefully. And at the same time, you feed them a very strong story of rhetoric about what a great country this is and how we're being terribly threatened by terrorism around the world. And they're not going to step out and do anything. They're going to spend a lot of time anesthetizing themselves with television, booze, drugs, whatever the heck they decide to anesthetize themselves with. It's extremely successful. And we have to turn that around. We can turn that around because these people don't want to be in that position. And it's going to take some doing to turn them around, but we can do it, We'll go back into history once again and see how a guy like Tom Paine with his book Common Sense turned people around. And a lot of those people were in the same position. They were struggling farmers, frontiersmen. They didn't really want to go up against the strongest empire in the history of the world. Who would have believed they could be successful? But they finally saw, they were inspired by Tom Paine and a few other orators and writers, and they began to understand. And so they did stand up to the system. We need to do something similar today, except today it'll be a bigger revolution. It'll be global, and it'll be a really much more significant revolution than anything that's happened before. We need that. You push people hard enough, and they're going to fight back. And the question is, how will we fight back? And if we go back to history, the American Revolution, which I've always been a great fan of, I have many ancestors that fought in it, but I've often been struck by the fact that it wasn't really exactly a revolution. We overthrew the yoke of the British Empire, but we sort of created our own aristocracy here, something very similar, not based on birthright, but based on money, based on property. So George Washington, our first president, owned a tremendous amount of property. And was a real estate agent, essentially. So were a lot of the other people. And so it was not a true revolution. It overthrew one aristocracy and accepted another form of aristocracy and moneyed-stocracy, if you want to call it that. I think the revolution that we need now is going to be one that'll really change our most basic approach to the economy, to how we deal with the world. We need to understand that we are a very fragile species living on a very tiny planet. And that for the first time in history, every human being on this planet is incredibly interconnected. We're all very dependent on each other. And we're very quickly destroying an amazingly beautiful, resource-rich planet. We're in the process of destroying it. And by doing so, we're in the process of destroying ourselves. I don't think there can be any question that we're headed down the path of extinction, and we can change it. We must change it. And I think once we realize, once enough of us, and it only takes a critical mass, it doesn't take every human being on this planet, but some critical mass of us understands that we're doing this, we're going to turn it around. And the prophecies from many, many indigenous cultures around the world tell us that this is the time of opportunity for very significant transformation, a transformation of consciousness. I think we're really marching into that period right now. And of course, it remains to be seen whether enough of us will really understand it and rise to higher levels of consciousness or not. But I do believe that our survival as a species depends on us understanding this, accepting the responsibility, and changing things significantly. Well, we are a paper economy. It's like that's what we produce, a lot of paper. Our lawyers and our investment bankers produce derivatives and mortgages and all kinds of paper swaps that don't really create anything that's helpful to people or animals or plants or the world in general. We've essentially stopped producing things in the United States. Paper economy. And now the other side of that is the military aspect, and we're a hugely militarized economy. Of course, a lot of that equipment we don't produce either. It's produced in other countries, but it runs through us, and the financing goes through us. So I think in this last budget, something like 25% of the budget was devoted directly to the military, but that didn't include Iraq or Afghanistan. Interestingly, those are side items. They're not included in the national budget. They're to the side. And that also doesn't address the fact that 25% that gets direct financing for military to build missiles, to build tanks, to build armor for people to wear on their bodies, etc. They also finance huge amounts of the banking industry, the insurance industry, the healthcare industry, and so many spin-offs. So when you say that we invest 25% of our national budget into the military, not including Iraq and Afghanistan, you also then have to add in probably another equal amount, or maybe 2 or 3 times that amount, as spin-offs to industries that support those that are getting direct military investments. So we're a military budget and we're a paper economy. Those two things combined, which means that we're living a very destructive lifestyle, one that's based on killing people and destroying resources, because wars destroy resources. And we're also doing this through paper in our own country, the United States, rather than through building factories. So in World War II, when we made military equipment, we built it ourselves. We put a lot of people to work. That boosted the economy. We also were at a time of tremendous innovation. So out of World War II, you got television, you got new forms of radio and communications. Ultimately, you got the computer, you got penicillin, you got a tremendous amount of medicines, frozen foods, and all kinds of other technologies and modern inventions came out of World War II. That's not happening in this war on terrorism, as we like to call it. We're not producing things that are going to help the general economy. In fact, we're not producing hardly any of that in the United States. So we're getting a triple or quadruple whammy here by the way we're conducting the economy. And so we need to move into a new form of economy. We need to move into something that really looks at how can we produce things that will help the world, that will help human beings, plants, animals, that will help us to survive as a species. We talk a lot about alternative energy. Sustainable energy, solar, wind. That's all very important, very good. But there's so many other things we can do too. I was recently in Nicaragua with a group of philanthropic investors, people who'd made a lot of money in the United States. And they were looking at how they could invest some of that money without necessarily ever getting it back, philanthropically invested to help poor campesinos in Nicaragua create organic farming and sell it to companies like Whole Foods, which was part of this whole process. But as we traveled around Nicaragua, we discovered that a great deal of the agricultural land there had been destroyed by Chiquita, Dole, Kraft, Cargill, the big agribusinesses from the United States. Can't be farmed organically. And we also discovered that the water, Nicaragua has amazing water resources, 2 huge lakes you can't see across, but terribly polluted. A lot of it as a result of our own industrial activities there and military activities. And it occurred to me, what if we took a percentage of our military budget and hired the same companies that are currently making missiles and tanks and other weapons of destruction, the Raytheons, and General Motors, and General Dynamics, General Electric, all the other generals out there. What if we paid them to instead come up with technologies that would clean up the polluted lands of Nicaragua and every other country on the planet? They're all polluted. And the polluted waters, and the polluted air. And not just the big companies, let's also put a lot of that money to encouraging small businesses and entrepreneurs. And what if we took another percentage of our military budget and encouraged the brilliant minds at places like Monsanto and Cargill and Chiquita to come up with ways for starving people of Africa to grow food more efficiently and have effective local storage and distribution systems, and again, also hire entrepreneurs and create small businesses to do that. We can create a whole new economy for the world. We don't have to put people out of work. We can create an economy right now with the problems that we've got, solving those problems. And I was also struck in Nicaragua, which is in a part of the world where there's been revolutionary activities. The current president of Nicaragua was a revolutionary, Danny Ortega, against U.S. forces, amongst other things. And it struck me that by doing something like that is the real way to also have true homeland security. Because we have to recognize that we can't have homeland security until we realize that the whole world is our homeland. My grandson is 3 years old, cannot feel secure when he's my age, unless every child growing up on every remote corner of this planet also feels secure. And that's a first in history. It hasn't been like this before. We're a very small planet, very interdependent and interrelated. We need to understand that and come up with methods that will develop a geopolitical economic system that's truly sustainable, just, sane, and promotes peace. Predatory capitalism is really the most eloquent definition of it came from Milton Friedman, and I use eloquent loosely because there's nothing truly eloquent about predatory capitalism, but he expressed it most concisely as three principles. One is that the only goal of business, the only responsibility of business is to maximize profits, regardless of social and environmental costs. Two, businesses shouldn't be regulated, or regulation should be minimized because regulations get in the way of making profits. And three, everything should be run by private business. Privatize the schools, the jails, the military. Today, we just recently heard from President Obama that we're moving in Afghanistan from U.S. government forces to private contractors in a big, big way. And those three tenets, maximize profits, no regulations, privatize everything, have led us to an extremely unfair, unbalanced, dangerous, insane world. A failure for everybody except the very few people who happen to sit at the top of the pyramid. So we need to change that. And let's come up with a new definition. And let's say, for example, it's okay for business to make profit, but only within the context of creating a sustainable, just, and peaceful world. So profits, but with social and environmental responsibility, where we recognize that corporations have to serve a larger interest, the public interest. Do we need to? The theory. Yeah. So let's create a new ideal where we say it's okay for business to make profits, but only within the context of creating a sustainable, just, and peaceful world. Profits, but with social and environmental responsibility. And let's face it, we have to regulate businesses. I mean, this idea that businesses don't need regulation is a farce. Human beings need to be watched to a certain degree. I mean, you can't just, we all realize that if you walk out on the street where there's pickpockets and kleptomaniacs, you're going to lose your wallet unless there's some laws against this and some regulations against it. Why should we think that CEOs are beyond that? They're not. We've discovered that at Enron and many other places. So we have to have some regulations around this. It's setting guidelines for the playing field. And this idea of privatizing everything, my God, it's like, how can you expect that corporate executives whose fiduciary responsibility is to their stockholders are going to do a better job at running public services than civil servants whose fiduciary responsibility is to the civic, the public? That's who they're sworn to take care of. Now, civil servants aren't always the most efficient people in the world, but that doesn't mean we get rid of them and replace them with corporate executives. We give them better incentives to do a better job, and we watch them more closely. I mean, there's ways to make our civil servants more effective, but not to throw them out. Let's have people running our schools and our jails and our other social services, healthcare, that are sworn to protect the public interest, not to take care of stockholders. That should not be their primary responsibility, which is what it is for corporate executives. So this idea of privatizing all of these sectors is crazy. It's ludicrous. And I'm all for private business within certain contexts, but not having it buy out the government services, which is what, as an economic hitman, I was getting countries to do around the world, getting them into this position where they owed a lot of money. And we said, well, we'll forgive some of your debt if you'll sell your water system to Bechtel. We'll forgive more of your debt if you sell your school system to so-and-so. We'll forgive even more of your debt if you sell your state-owned oil company to Exxon, and so on and so forth. It was a subterfuge. It was blackmail and extortion. And now since then, have been doing that here in the United States also. It's time to put an end to that. It's interesting. I've lived in cultures that don't have money. It's all barter. I've lived deep in the Amazon with people there when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the late 60s. It was all barter. There was no money. And that's a fairly awkward system. Can be extremely awkward. So when you introduce a little money instead as a way of trading things, so, I've got papayas and I trade my papayas for your chickens, but what I really want is that guy's bananas over there. But now I got to take your chicken, and now I got to go over and give him the chicken because that's what he wants. So when you bring money into it, you fall out of that loop. So money becomes an easier way of socializing. It becomes an easier way of trading when it's used that way. But unfortunately, through literature, through all kinds of devices, we've come to accept money as the goal, not as a vehicle to make trading easier, but as the goal. Accumulate it, put it in banks, put it in stock, have huge amounts of it, let it keep building and building upon itself. Let me be able to say, when I was a kid, if somebody could say he was a millionaire, that was amazing. Now it's almost meaningless. It's like you got to be a billionaire or more, and it's become this goal in and of itself. There's a sickness there. It's an addiction, and it's crazy. And it also means that it drives people to do everything they possibly can to exploit everybody else just to get more money. It has also encouraged sociopaths. I think it's created sociopaths. People that wouldn't have been sociopaths otherwise have this happen in the same way that people that wouldn't have become criminals when they become addicted to crack or some other drug, they become criminals because they have to feed their habit. And so people are trying to feed this habit of getting more and more wealthy, and they'll do anything to make it happen. It's a sickness, and we need to turn that around. Put value in things other than money. Just to look at money and say, it's dirty. It's just paper, and most of it is literally dirty by the time it gets passed around. Let's put the value where it really belongs. And we're seeing some remarkable changes occur. Once again, we go to Latin America. Go to Ecuador, where the president there, Rafael Correa, serving a second term now, He has a PhD in economics from the University of Illinois. He understands economics. He understands the corporatocracy, and he's standing up to the corporatocracy. He's saying, you know, you're not going to get away with exploiting my people anymore. Fair share of the profits from our oil and other resources has to go to our people, and you've got to protect our rainforests and our other fragile environments. And he pushed through a new constitution in Ecuador, which is the first constitution in the history of mankind that gives inalienable rights to nature. Amazing. And now he's working very hard on creating a new currency that will put value on women taking care of babies, something that mothers usually aren't paid for. That'll put value on all kinds of things that are not generally part of the moneyed economy. In other words, he's looking at creating a currency that's not based on the Federal Reserve System, the central bank system, which is a usurious system, which generates all kinds of interest. And so money then becomes a resource in and of itself. You have a certain amount of money, I can give it to somebody who will promise to pay me interest on it. So I don't even need to go out and think about growing corn or doing anything else productive. All I got to do is keep accumulating money. In Korea, PhD economists are saying, that's an addictive, sick system. We want a system in our country that will go back to the old idea that there's a currency, a type of currency there that simply reflects the value of work people do, whether that work is producing something that you can put your hands around or serving families, as mothers do when they breastfeed their children or teach their children. It's a beautiful concept. And of course, there's aspects of it. Many parts of Europe, communities have these types of moneyed economies, and we're looking at it in parts of the United States. We really need to move in that direction. You know, as an economic hitman, I never made a lot of money at all. I worked for a corporation. I did pretty well, but I had incredible expense accounts. And I'd grown up the son of prep school teachers in New Hampshire at a boys' private school. We never had much money. My dad didn't get paid hardly anything. He had free housing, free food. Everything was taken care of, so we lived pretty decent lives. But I remember as a kid on a hot summer day trying to get my dad to buy me an ice cream cone, and I was allowed one a week. He didn't have cash. And here I was raised with all these very wealthy young men who went to the school. And when I went to that school, I found myself becoming extremely envious of them. I would be stuck at Christmas vacation, for example, in the snowbound New Hampshire, all alone on this campus, empty campus. Day after day, I shot baskets in the school gym by myself because I had a key to the gym. My dad did. And at the end of the vacation, these guys, it was all boys, would come back from Buenos Aires and Paris and New York, wherever they happened to have gone, talking about these amazing orgies and parties they had participated in, all these things that they had done. It was really tough. I had to get a full scholarship to school. I was aware that I had to get really good grades. I was captain of a couple of sports and so on and so forth, editor of the newspaper, constantly struggling. But I had this desire always to do the things that I heard these other guys had done, go to these exotic places. And so I went in the Peace Corps, and while I was in the Peace Corps, I was recruited to go to work for this company as an economist, and I became chief economist and the head economic hitman. And I was able to travel around the world flying first class, staying in the best hotels, eating in the fanciest restaurants wherever I went, wining and dining with presidents and beautiful women, all the things that I had coveted. And later it became very clear to me that when I went through this test, when I was still in business school, before I went in the Peace Corps, I had been recruited by the National Security Agency. They put me through a series of tests, personality tests, including an almost all day lie detector test. And they discovered that I would make a good economic hitman, and that I had these hooks, which I think are the three big drugs of our culture. I wanted power, money, sex, and money was the least important. I wanted the power and the sex, which money can buy or you can get it other ways. And then When I started working for Charles T. Main, I was trained by this woman who I talk about in my books, whose name was Claudine, who knew everything about me, knew about all these hooks, was extremely clever, extremely seductive, and gave me, and promised to give me all of this: sex, money, power. And it brought me in. At the same time, what I was doing was what we were taught to do in business school. And I didn't do anything illegal. The jackals were doing illegal stuff, but I wasn't part of that. I was arranging for large loans to poor developing countries to build infrastructure projects. And all the business school models say that's what you need to do to grow an economy. And in fact, statistically, you can show that it works. If you make a huge loan to a country like Ecuador, and they build big hydroelectric projects and transmission and distribution lines, you see an increase in gross national product. You do. And so the statistics supported what I was doing. But over time, perhaps because I'd been in the Peace Corps for 3 years and seen the people on the other side, I began to really understand that it was, again, a subterfuge, that economic growth in these countries only benefited a few wealthy families, that the majority of the people were living outside the economy. They weren't on the records. They were living with barter. They were shopping in local markets, maybe using currency, but it never made the records because it was these local markets. So they weren't part of that progress. In fact, they were getting poorer. The rich were getting richer off these projects. The poor were getting poorer, and the middle class was slowly dissolving into the poor class. And over a period of 10 years, I saw this. I was an economic hitman for 10 years. And by the end of it, it became very, very clear to me that the system we were perpetrating was a lousy, terrible system, not at all what it was built up to be. And I saw this long before I got out, probably midway through, but I was living a very good life. I was traveling to these exotic places, Indonesia, Iran, Egypt, all over South America, all over the world, and living a very comfortable, good life. Not making a huge salary by any means, but living a very, very comfortable life, living the dream that I had had since I was young. And so I kept going at it. And I think, like so many people, the system allowed me to justify doing the wrong thing. I run into executives at places like BP, Nike, Monsanto, that are very much like I used to be. They're living really good lives, and they're justifying it by saying, well, we're making things better. We're in here, ultimately we're going to win. We're going to do a good job. We're making a better world. But really, they know they're not. However, it's very easy to justify it. Our colleges tell us it's the right way. We have tons of HR people, psychologists, psychiatrists, all kinds of people saying, yeah, this is the right way, you know. Well, Nike may be having some labor problems in Indonesia, and maybe our working conditions aren't the best, but hang in there. We're going to make it better. You're going to be part of that. And they buy into it. I bought into it. And then I saw the light. And for me, it had been building up, but there was one particular moment when I was on vacation, sailing in the Caribbean. And I had my sailboat anchored off St. John Island in the Virgin Islands. I rowed the dinghy into shore, and I climbed up this hill to the ruins of an old sugarcane plantation. Not Ancon, I'm sorry. Anyway, I climbed up this hill to the ruins of this old sugarcane plantation, and was sitting up there, the sun's setting, and I'm surrounded by bougainvillea growing on these old stones, the crumbling stones of this plantation. It was very idyllic. It was beautiful. And then suddenly I realized that this plantation had been built on the bones of thousands of slaves. And then I thought, my God, the whole hemisphere has been built on the bones of millions of slaves. And at that point, I had to admit to myself that I too was a slaver, that what I was doing around the world was putting people into slavery. I wasn't dragging them out of jungles and putting them in irons and carrying them across the ocean in the hulls of ships, but I was putting them in a new kind of slavery, an economic slavery that in many respects is just about as bad, different. And at that point, I made the decision that I would never do it again, that I'd get out. And I went back to my headquarters a couple of days later and quit. Cultural self-deception, yeah, absolutely. And this driving force of money or what it can buy. And in my case, I was making decent money, and there was the prospect that I was going to make a lot more. It was being held out to me that by the time I was 40, I would be a millionaire because I was an owner of the company. It was like a partnership, a closely held corporation. About 5% of us, in a company of 2,000 consultants, about 5% of us were the owners, and I became an owner. And the promise was held out that by the time I was 40, I would be a millionaire, which was a big thing back in the late 70s. $1 million was worth a lot more than it is today. And that was a driving force, even though I wasn't making a huge salary. But I was living that life.
You were enjoying the things that money can buy.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have to make the money because I had a huge expense account, which in many respects is better than making the money because you don't pay taxes on an expense account. So if you get $100,000 in an expense account, that's worth like $140,000 in salary because you don't have to pay taxes on it. So yeah, I was living this life that was based on material wealth and status and all the things that money can buy. Well, we are the change, and we must be the change. It's not going to come from a president. We've seen that very obviously. I think we have to understand that presidents are extremely vulnerable. Kennedy was assassinated, and we saw with Bill Clinton how you can have character assassination. You don't have to shoot a guy. You can just, send in a woman who keeps the dress and shows the stain afterwards. That's a form of assassination too. And I think a guy like President Obama is extremely aware that he's in a very, very vulnerable position on many, many different levels. And it's also true that we the people have always had to do it. We didn't get rid of slavery in the United States because Abraham Lincoln suddenly found himself in the White House. We got rid of slavery because we voted in a president who swore that he would get rid of slavery. And the majority of the people of the United States wanted to get rid of slavery. And we kept insisting upon it. Women didn't get the right to vote because Woodrow Wilson was pro-suffrage. He wasn't. But women got the right to vote because they kept demanding it. They'd been doing it for about 50 years. And then when Wilson became president, he traveled all over the United States trying to drum up support to send troops, U.S. troops, to Europe to defend democracy in World War I. Women followed him everywhere he went. They hounded him. They shouted at him. They carried placards. They wrote articles for newspapers. They handed out leaflets. And they said, listen, President Wilson, we're not sending our men to fight for democracy in Europe. We don't have democracy here. We can't vote. Half the United States can't vote. We women can't vote. Why should we defend democracy in Europe when we don't have it here? He got it. They said, give us the right to vote and we'll support sending troops. He did. And troops did go to World War I. We've seen this time and time again. We the people took up against Vietnam. We the people made the civil rights movement happen. It started with a handful, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. and others whose names we now know. But it's always been we the people. And it will be we the people in the future. And we each have to recognize that we have tremendous power. One of the places we can show this is in the way we shop or don't shop. So if we support companies that are committed to creating a sustainable world and a just world, and send them emails telling them that we're supporting them because of that, and we don't buy from companies that aren't committed to that, and we send them emails. So for example, if everyone who watches this movie sends an email to Nike and says, I'm not buying any more from you because you've still got sweatshops, you have slaves in Indonesia. Turn those sweatshops into legitimate factories where the workers are paid real wages and have decent working conditions, and then I'll buy from you. And also send an email to the company that they do buy from, telling them that they're buying from them because they are trying to make the world a better place. We have tremendous power that way. And each one of us has more power than that. We all have passion. Everyone has passion. And everybody has talents. I don't know what anyone out there, any listener, I don't know what your passions or your talents are, but I know that you have passions and talent. I have a passion for writing, and I think hopefully I have a certain talent for it. But everybody has passion and talents. And if we follow our individual passions and use our talents, then we're successful. That's what makes for success. And if we each use our passions and talents to do our individual thing, but we all head toward the same destination of creating a sustainable, just, and peaceful world, we'll get there. We have to keep moving in that direction. So if a person's a carpenter, use their carpentry skills, their passion for carpentry and their talents for that to create things that are more sustainable, to build houses, for example, that are sustainable houses, that are well insulated and use solar energy and wind power, whatever's appropriate in the location. If I'm a writer, I'd like to write about these things. Filmmakers make films about these things, but whatever you do, direct it toward that always, and toward reining in the corporations, and letting the corporations know that they only exist because we allow them to exist. The marketplace is democratic if we choose to make it such. And we've had tremendous success in the past. We got rid of apartheid in South Africa because we refused to support corporations that contributed to apartheid. We get rid of aerosol cans that were destroying the ozone layer because we insisted that corporations get rid of them. We got corporations to open their doors wider to minorities and women because we insisted on it, to clean up terribly polluted rivers. When I went to business school in Boston, I couldn't walk beside the Charles River. It was so polluted. It was foul. There were rivers in Ohio that were on fire with pollution. No more. We got the corporations to clean them up. More recently, we've got trans fats out of foods and antibiotics out of chickens. We have tremendous power. But now we have to ratchet it up a notch and say, listen, we will only support corporations that have as their goal, making profits can be a goal, secondary goal, but the main goal is to serve the public interest. So we'll only support corporations that can make a profit, but only while creating a sustainable world, a just world, a peaceful world, an environmentally and socially responsible society. And if we only vote in the marketplace for those corporations, they're the ones that will be elected. The others will fall by the wayside, as many corporations have in the past. There's so much we as individuals can do. You go back, you look at the civil rights movement. Who was Rosa Parks? When I was a kid growing up in New Hampshire, I had no idea that African Americans had to ride on the back of a bus in many parts of the United States until Rosa Parks showed me. Who was she? She was a seamstress. She was a member of the NAACP, yes. But above all, she was one woman who had the guts to walk from the back of a bus to the front and sit there. Anybody can do that. Anybody can do that. And as a kid growing up in New Hampshire, I had no idea that the DDT that we were spraying on the mosquitoes in the swamp behind our house was also killing fish and birds until Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring. Who was Rachel Carson? When she sat down to write that book, she had no idea that it would ever be published, much less that it would start a global environmental movement, which is what it did. Who was she? Who are any of these people? We're all teachers. We can all do things. We have tremendous power. The power is within us. And this is the time to use it. The indigenous people around the world tell us that we come into this life at this time in history into the specific parents that we choose because we have a mission. And in our culture, we tend not to look at missions. We look at goals, getting good grades, going to a good school, finding a good spouse, having a good kid, encouraging the good kid to get good grades, da-da-da-da-da-da. But indigenous cultures say you got a mission. It's a bigger mission. It's about the community as a whole. And you spend your life really trying to understand that mission and accomplish it. And I think this is a time to look at that each one of us has a mission in life. We came into this world at this particular time, a time that's prophesized by indigenous cultures around the world as being a time for the potential for tremendous transformation, an awakening, a rising of consciousness. And if we each look at that and look at ourselves as coming into this world at this time because we have a mission, we look toward what is our mission, what is our passion. That's where the mission starts. What are our abilities? What are our talents? What are our capabilities? And if we all move down that path toward a sustainable, just and peaceful world, we'll get there. It's beautiful, yeah. I think if we understand every time we pay for something that's energy. Money represents energy in one form or another. And where does that energy come from? What's driving the energy behind our culture today? And unfortunately, the answer right now is war and paper and greed, extreme materialism. And to really understand each time we pay that out that's what we're supporting, and to have that consciousness. It's always interested me that we call a dollar a buck. And the reason we do is because not too long ago, one of those pieces of paper with a $1 and a $sign on it was worth a deer. So if I went out in the woods of New Hampshire and shot a deer, I could take that to a butcher and he'd give me a buck for my buck. And if you think about that, the life of a deer is what went into that piece of paper. And I could take that buck and I could go buy a sack of grain or whatever I needed, a carriage. I don't know what I could buy with it, but that's how I used it. But I would be very aware that I had to kill an animal, a beautiful animal, in order to get that buck. And I think it made me, back in those days, much more conscious of what money was worth or wasn't worth. Today we don't have that association with it, but we ought to. We ought to recognize, if we own a clothing store, that if these clothes that we're selling in that store are made in a sweatshop, that's like killing a deer. That's blood money. If, on the other hand, we buy our clothes from people that are really doing it organically and with a tremendous social consciousness, and there are a lot of people out there making clothes that way now, trying very hard. Again, I don't think anybody's perfect, but they're trying very hard. If we support those people, it's a very different feeling. And the opportunity is here for us to do that. Regardless of what our business or occupation is, we can always make those choices. You know, it doesn't matter what you do or how you do it, but there's always a lot of choices. And if we keep moving in that direction of buying things when we need to buy them and only when we need to buy them, that are created with a social and environmental consciousness, then we'll be headed in the right direction. And we'll be saving the bucks of the world. I think it's very significant that the 10 countries in Latin America that have voted in these presidents who are standing up to the corporatocracy, every one of those countries during most of my lifetime was run by a brutal dictator. Most of those dictators were put into place by the CIA and kept there by the CIA. And that's true whether you're talking about Bolivia or Ecuador or Venezuela or any of those countries. They were all run by brutal dictators under our thumb. But all that changed within the past few years. Democratically, it changed. It's very significant, I think. And what I see in this country, it's very encouraging to me as I travel around. I speak a lot at universities. I speak at a lot of MBA programs, Stanford and Wharton and Cornell and Columbia, to some of the most conservative young men and women who are in these schools because they want to run big businesses. That's where they're recruited from. And 5 years ago, when I started on this speaking tour, which has been kind of endless since then, after Confessions came out, I would hear something very different from what I hear now. And when my publicist would arrange for me to go to these universities, I would always ask her to arrange for me to have dinner with 12 to 3 students before my talk. And I would sit there at the table with them and say, listen, you're going to hear from me for the next couple of hours. Now I want to hear from each of you. Let's go around the table. I want each of you to tell me why you're in this school, why are you getting an MBA or whatever, and why are you having dinner with me tonight? And what are your aspirations? And 5 years ago, I consistently heard these students say that they were in this business because they wanted to make money and they wanted to have power. They didn't necessarily say it quite that bluntly, but that's what they were saying. This year, I don't hear that at all. I hear that they're there because they want to create a better world. And so, some of them will say they have big debts coming out of school and they may have to go to work for corporations, but that's not why they're going to school. And if they go to work for big corporations, they want to change those corporations. That they understand that they want to have kids someday. And they want the kids to grow up in a world where there will still be rainforests. And a world that we can all recognize. That's very encouraging to me in a period of 5 years. And if I look at my 5 years out on the road one way, it seems like a very long time. But if I look at it another way, it's a blink in history, you know? And I hear that not just in the United States, but in China. I was in China this past year, and I was speaking there at a convention of MBA students, mostly Chinese MBA students, a lot of them. And it was a conference on making business more responsible. And the Chinese kept telling me, Chinese students, MBA students, that they realized that China in the last 30 years has proven that miracles happen. So in 1970, I could stand in the new territories outside Hong Kong and look into China, but I couldn't go into China. And he would say, I want to go into China. What's it like? Nobody knew what it was like. It was truly dark, mysterious. It was a country that was considered to still be in the dark ages. Nixon went in 71 and opened up China, if you want to call it that. And in the last 3 decades, China has had double-digit economic growth every single year. That's unheard of. If anybody had said that to me back in 1970 when I was standing looking into China, that would happen, I would have said, you're absolutely crazy. It's never happened in history, and it surely isn't going to happen in China. But it has happened. And it's come at a big environmental and social cost. We all know that. The Chinese students know that. And they say, but what we've learned is that miracles happen. We can create magic here. And we're going to become the greenest country in the world. That's our goal as students. We're going to be the next managers of the Chinese government and the corporations here. And that's where we're headed. I heard that over there from them time after time. I spent about 10 days in China hanging out with the students in addition to teaching some workshops and lecturing. I also spent a lot of time as their guest traveling around with them and talking to them. And then I came back here and I went to speak at Wharton and some of the other MBA programs, and I sent that out as a challenge. I said, so the Chinese students say they're going to be the greenest country. Why don't you make it happen here first? Let's have an Olympics. Let's have a green Olympics. Which country in the world can be the greenest fastest? What young people can come along and play the World Cup of social and environmental responsibility. And I see young people around the world, Latin America. I was in Iceland also last year and heard the same thing there. Wherever I go, I hear young people being very, very concerned about where we are today and determined to do something better because they know they're going to have to live with it and their kids are going to have to live with it. So I think that's encouraging. And as an older guy, I take this as a responsibility and a challenge to mentor them and inspire and encourage them to think in those ways and let them know that that is how they'll be happiest. What's prosperity? It isn't the amount of money we have, it's the way we prosper. And how do we prosper? We prosper through having good food, organic food, clean water, clean air, a good place to bring up our kids, a good spiritual life. That's prosperity. And that's where we need to head, toward true prosperity.